Let me start by two disclaimers. As it's announced in the program, this is both a keynote and a concluding remarks. And I'm not quite sure whether I can deliver either. The concluding remarks, because I have missed a couple of the sessions, and I feel very bad about it, but I had some justifiable reasons. And then second, the keynote, perhaps at this late hour at the end of the conference, is going to be a little bit too heavy. So I'm trying to lighten it up a little bit by showing you some images and carry through the story of the constitutional revolution. It's not going to have a grand theory. I'm going to make some observations which I hope would be relevant to the theme of the conference. We'll see. In Search of Modern Iran, the title that has been chosen for me by Dr. Ansari for this talk, which is supposed to be the title of my forthcoming book, is, if my editor would allow me, because he's looking for something more trendy. I don't know what could be more trendy than In Search of Modern Iran. I kept telling him this shows a sense of continuity. This is a process, and it would probably attract the readership to try to see what is this search for modern Iran. He says, no, you start with 1501, and there is nothing modern in 1501. I said, well, read the text and you'll find out there is something. But anyway, whatever it is that I try to come up with a subtitle to make it a little bit more manageable. So it's representation of modernity in the Iranian constitutional revolution. But this morning, as I was juxtaposing images, I was thinking to myself, even that is too much. This is representation of modernity is a huge topic. So bear with me if there are disappointments in some of the things I'm going to show you. Well, first point, in June of 2009, in the aftermath of the Green Movement, which I'm sure you're all very familiar with, the authorities in the Islamic Republic of Iran labeled the protesters and the whole movement as a fitne. And that's the term that is being labeled on the Green Movement up to our time. The concept of the fitne, I was thinking to myself then and now, is rather interesting. Fitne, as I'm sure many of you in this audience would know, means sedition or seductive rebellion of, or subversion, one might say. Seductive subversion is the real meaning, is the Quranic old terminology for fitna. And in the course of Islamic history, it has often been associated, particularly in Iran, which was a kind of very fertile ground for all kinds of fitna, with the kinds of trends, religious, or one might call socio-religious. Contemporary historians would like to call them socio-religious, but in the traditional context, religious. It's always associated with movements that either openly or somewhat in cryptic form were questioning, subverting the authority of the religious establishment and by extension, the power of the state. So, as a matter of fact, a reference to 2009 as a fitna somewhat makes sense, because indeed this was yet another movement that questioned the authority of both the religious ideology of the Islamic Republic and also the regime in power. How that relates to our story is that 2009 was the centennial of year 1909, when the constitutionalists fought against the royalists and their allies, which were the religious establishment, or a big chunk of the religious establishment, including led by the well-known theologian Sheikh Fazlullah Nuri, and those who were promoting the idea of mashru'a, that is kind of a Sharia-based constitution during the course of the during the course of the constitutional revolution. In July of 1909, the revolutionaries managed eventually to defeat the royalists in a rather heroic story, which I think the Iranians in general and those historians of the constitutional revolution should be very proud of. This is a movement that had a kind of unified the country, and probably it's one of the earliest manifestations of a sense of a nationhood in modern context. And as such, the victory in 1909 was kind of opened a new horizons and hopes for a different environment, for a different constitutional regime to be confirmed or reconfirmed in power, and Iran moving in a different direction. However, in reality, that almost instantaneously, in a very short period of time, the victory was viewed as a kind of a start of what is eventually came to be defined as a failure of the constitutional revolution, which up to our time is indeed still part of the discourse of the constitutional revolution, that indeed the constitutional revolution eventually failed. And the origins of it indeed goes back to 1909, 1910, 1911, shortly after the victory of the nationalists or the constitutionalists, as they called themselves, the Mujahideen. Why this was so? When, particularly, we are dealing with a revolution that, at least in my mind, was a kind of a turning point in the story of modernity in Iran. It's not the starting point, it's not the departure point, but it's definitely a major turning point. Writing the history that eventually is going, hopefully, to come out, this became even more tangible, that indeed the story of the constitutional revolution is something that Iran has been preoccupied with ever since its occurrence, and still probably it's a work in progress. In a sense, the questions that were raised, and particularly the question of modernity that was raised in the course of the constitutional revolution, still in one way or another is with us. Yesterday in the panel, that topic came up, and again in many of the presentations and the papers in this conference, we heard various aspects of how the issue of modernity still corresponds to that past. Why this was a unique revolution, in a sense? Why this is such an important event in the longue durée of Iranian history? I think it's not an exaggeration, and certainly I hope it's not a chauvinistic Persian claim to say that the constitutional revolution perhaps was the first and in many respects the only popular revolution in the entire Muslim world, or at least in the entire Middle East. I have to be very careful about what I'm saying. Yes, a year later, in 1908, or 2 years later, in 1908, there was the very well-known Young Turks Revolution in the Ottoman Empire that completely transformed the Ottoman polity and eventually decade or more later resulted in the dissolution of the Ottoman Empire. There were other events, the Denshawi event in 1919 in Egypt. There were earlier examples of attempts to try to establish constitutional regime in the Ottoman Empire in 1871, rather unsuccessful, but nevertheless a very important episode. But all of this does not really, these examples that I have just mentioned, and there are much more, does not correspond to the idea of a classic revolution. Of course, what is a classic revolution? I try to look up and see, okay, how you can define a classic revolution. Well, Iranians, of course, are very good in making revolutions, but they're not very good in actually defining it. So they try hard. But I looked at Brenton's famous The Anatomy of the Revolution, a very classic work for anybody who isn't interested in the topic. And actually, the constitutional revolution seems to fit the bill rather well. And I tell you why. The first of the characteristics is that this was a popular revolution. This was not a revolution from the top. This was not a revolution by an elite, in the case of the Young Turks Revolution, by a really small crust of officers, intellectuals, perhaps some members of the nobility, Ottoman nobility, that actively participated. It was not a revolution in terms of thousands of people in the streets. It was not a process. Of course, it was a process, but it was not a process of a popular participation and mobilization. This was one characteristic that the constitutional revolution indeed should be differentiates it from what happened in other instances. The second one, I need a little bit more room to open and bring out my notes. All right. The second point, which is also fascinating to me, and perhaps it's more pertinent to the theme of this seminar, this conference, is the fact that, well, let me first show you about what I mean by popular participation, because I promised you to show you some images. This is the sacred day of the 10th of Muharram, Ashura, most likely around 1905, although I'm not quite sure. Myra, who yesterday gave a wonderful paper on postcards, perhaps will be able to help me. She's not in the audience anyway. You are. Do you have any idea about the date?
The date of the postcard?
Yes.
So the issue with the dating is that usually the date of the photographed event is recorded on the card, but the date of printing or publishing is usually not recorded. Well, but there is something called the electric number, which is like on the back of the card, and so you have the records from the printing factories, which then you could
Identify.
Publishing date, but the problem is, as I said, a lot of the printing factories were based in Germany, and those records burned in the Second World War.
Okay.
And so, yeah.
Well, my sense of the multitudes, I mean, that's why I wanted to show you here. These are multitudes that coming to a preacher, to listen to a preacher. And it actually nicely corresponds to the kind of contemporary accounts of the constitutional revolution that we have in, say, the history of the Iranian awakening, Tarikh Bidari Iranian, number of other diaries and accounts of the period that tells you these massive numbers that come out to listen to preachers. So that's one aspect of it that I wanted to point out. That's not the only one. If you look, there is a certain element of agency with the general public. This is the telegraph house in Shiraz. These are ordinary people. In 1908, circa 1908, again, we don't know exactly. This is by a local photographer in Shiraz whose collection miraculously survived. and shows us just the ordinary people taking sanctuary in the telegraph house in order to send their messages to the capital. And that's another characteristic of the Constitutional Revolution, rather remarkable, that they somewhat very quickly managed to master the communication, new modern technologies of communication, in this case telegraph, that played a tremendous part, not only in centralization of Iran in the latter part of the 19th century, but in the way that it was subverted and used basically by the people to send their messages across, not only to the capital, but to the other cities, to the other communities. So in a sense, the emergence of a virtual national community comes up with the idea of people recognizing and discovering the significance of telegraph. It's the same with the postcards, as we heard yesterday. It's the same with the press, of course, that thrives in the period between 1890s and 1910s and afterwards. And we'll see at least one example of that in a moment. Publication of the explosion of the publishing houses during the constitutional period, translation of text. I think we heard yesterday, or I'm sure today, in the course of the translations of historical texts, the first accounts of Russo-Japanese war fought in 1905, which was an enormous boost to the Iranians who saw their traditional hegemon in the north, the Russians, being defeated by the Asian power, that is the Japanese, had three translations, including two translations, and including a book composed in poetry, as Iranians are very good at that, called Mikadoname, in the style of Shahnameh. And that again is a kind of a part of this Persianization process that Iranians, during the course of the Constitutional Revolution, very successfully managed to incorporate. Yesterday we heard about this whole constellation of ideas that were moving about in the region, and how well they could incorporate the selective features of these ideas, including the ideas of Enlightenment, into their own milieu and within their own discourse familiar to the public. So that's another important characterization of the characteristic of the Constitutional Revolution. The third, perhaps, is the fact that this kind of appearance of the masses participating in the Constitutional Revolution, in a sense, is the start of the emergence of a middle class, or really a more distinct middle class, a voice of the middle class, or a bourgeoisie. And I'll come back to that later on in order to say that why this middle class could not carry the message and ideology of the Constitutional Revolution. And after all, perhaps another characteristic of it is that it's a revolutionary process, as I pointed out. It's nothing that started from one point. A constitution was granted to the Iranians by the rulers of the country, and that was it. It was a process, a dynamic of give and take that took all the years of the Constitutional Revolution. Every word of the fundamental law, despite the fact that it may seem to us that this is a kind of very much influenced by the Belgian or by the French Constitution of 1848, as a matter of fact, was fought in the parliament on every term of it. And as a matter, if you look at what came out of it, the vocabulary of the Constitutional Revolution is very much vernacular, in a sense. It's not, the terms are not those that were taken from European ideologies and incorporated into the Constitution. The concepts are very familiar. The concept of majlis, for instance, it's something that has a very profound history in Perso-Islamic past. The idea of shura, or consultation, which is the very foundation of the notion of parliament, is also something, or rather deliberation in the parliament, is something that goes back, and for it there was always justifications were found in the sacred text. This one, the concept of, Quranic concept of consulting among yourself, that became a big rubric of the constitutional period. The concept of justice, adl, that was the basis for the notion of social justice, one of the major ideologies of the, or major objectives of the constitutional revolution, again had a very strong resonance, and particularly some kind of, one might say, messianic resonance. Of course, one can argue that Shiism through and through is a messianic religion, a messianic faith. As some of you might know, the concept of adl, or justice, is one of the foundations of the Shi'i belief system, and its association with the constitutional movement and with the constitutional demands also corresponds to this idea of how the notions from outside were taken and Persianized and were became part of the vernacular, indigenized by the constitutionalists. Also, I think another interesting characteristic of it is the fact that it provided some kind of an agenda for a long-term process of modernization in Iran. Most of the time, when we talk about constitutionalism, we often talk about the text of the Constitution, which incidentally was never referred to as constitution. It was referred to as Qanun Asasi, that is the fundamental law, although the concept of Qanun somewhat was a Turco or Ottoman Persian term with a very long history that goes back to the Greek past. But nevertheless, it is not a Western term. And there was a very conscious desire not to use this term in order not to be accused by the opponents of the constitutionalism or by the more conservative sectors of the society as being Western, or as being an importation of an ideology of disbelief from the outside. It's all part of what is happening inside our society. It's nothing from outside. So if, in a sense, the very idea of Qanun Asasi is closely associated with the constitutional revolution, but constitutional revolution, in a sense, if you read the demands of popular demands of the time, goes far beyond that. It involves material improvement. It's in certain respects even much more important than what we would consider as the rule of law, or the division of powers, or the limitations to the authority of the ruler, and so forth. What was important for people are very desperate issues of their own time. They wanted better standard of living in a world that was exposed, particularly for the business establishment, that is the merchant class in Iran, that was exposed to all kinds of fluctuations in the international market, currency fluctuations in the international market, that brought about around 1905, 1906, a major crisis worldwide. So if you would like to look at the economic background of it, this is part of the reason why there was so much of a discontent. And this discontent was reflected in the demand, for instance, for the creation of a national bank that was part of the major debate of the first Majlis, the first parliament, vis-a-vis the Imperial Bank of Persia, that was part of the concessions of the 19th century, given to a British company, or to a British concessionaire, that basically dominated the finances of Iran throughout the latter decade of the 19th century and by the time of the Constitutional Revolution. And as everything that had some kind of a British origin in Iran, there has to be something of a Russian equivalent, and that was the Russian loan bank of Persia that managed very successfully to give enormous amount of loans to the Iranian nobility and to the merchants and make all of them eventually bankrupt. So that is the time that you see there's a huge financial crisis, emphasis on the idea of banking, finances, control of the government of the customs. These are all becomes demands of the Constitutional Revolution. Communication, roads, education above all, all are part and parcel of what constitutionalism was about. So normally, again, there is a kind of a condescending attitude towards the Constitutional Revolution, mostly by, well, originally by kind of a Western scholarship, and later on has been very successfully welcomed and incorporated by the Iranian nationalist historiography as well, by pointing out that most of the people in Iran had no idea what constitution was all about. Nobody knew what is mashrute is, as if all of them were supposed to be Montesquieu when they were, let me move on to show you some more. These people were supposed to, were at the very foundation of what the Constitution, how the Constitution came about. This is in the famous British legation, sanctuary in the British legation in very beginning of the 1906 that led to the granting of the farman, the decree of the Constitution, which incidentally is a decree that never mentions the term Constitution. Mashrute doesn't appear in it. So this is the grocery guild that you see. These are ordinary people who were participating. That's the element of agency. I'm sorry, I still have to master this. You see here the Clodier Guild in the sanctuary of the British legation. So that was the kind of an involvement that you see thanks to the postcards that gives us that wonderful moments of popular participation. Let me see what I have here as well. Yes. Something which I think is going to be at the, really, something that I haven't said before, and I would like to, anybody, most of what I'm saying here is this big art entry that Professor Martin, myself, and a number of other people wrote in Encyclopedia Iranica on the topic of the Constitutional Revolution. But this is something new that I thought might interest you. The image, which is the legend of the newspaper, the title of the newspaper, Sur Esrafil, Seraphim's Trumpet, and the translation of it is important, is a family, probably the most well-known newspaper of the constitutional period. Let me bring out my, where is the pointer? Yeah, here it is. Okay. Oh, what happened? It's a divine intervention, perhaps. Because, okay, thank you. All right. As you can see, I think the legend itself is quite remarkable in the sense that it would, I think it's self-explanatory. This is Seraphim, the angel, the archangel, that when he blows in his trumpet, the end of the time is announced. So here you see a very distinctive apocalyptic theme, or rather, one would say a messianic theme. What Seraphim blows in his trumpet is the message that comes here. Liberty, liberty, equality, fraternity. حریت، مساوات، اخوت. So that's how you see that this message has been incorporated to a tradition that is very familiar for the Iranians. One can say that this is indeed an attempt to secularize the whole discourse of apocalypticism into the constitutional revolution. And this is just not an anomaly. First of all, look at the two verses. وَنَفَخَ فِي الصُّورِ فَإِذَا هُمْ مِنَ الْأَحْدَاثِ عَلَى رَبِّهِمْ يَنْسِلُونَ, and another one, فَإِذَا نَفَخَ فِي الصُّورِ فَلَا أَنْصَابَ بَيْنَهُم. Both of them verses from the Quran with very specific apocalyptic connotation. Both of them are, in a sense, the latter part says when Seraphim blows in the trumpet, there would be no difference among you all. So it's a sense of equality is incorporated into the message of the constitutional revolution. I say this is not an anomaly because I counted 4, I think, of the major newspapers of the constitutional period, all of them with the same apocalyptic messianic message. Najm Saqib, the fallen star, which is the newspaper of a well-known advocate of the constitutional period and later the first historian of the constitutional revolution, who indeed wrote The Awakening of Persia as a serial in his newspaper called Najm Saqib, the fallen star. Why Najm Saqib is important? Because that's a sign of the end of the time. When the stars fall, which is the biblical account and the Quranic account at the same time of the coming of the end. Then the other newspaper, Ruhul Quds, again by a very well-known constitutionalist who was later on, along with the editor of this journal, was executed by Muhammad Ali Shah in 1909 and in 1908 during the course of what is referred to as minor tyranny period, called his newspaper Ruhul Quds, the Holy Spirit. And that again, in the Islamic messianic apocalyptic context, has a particular meaning of the end of the time. But these were pretty modern. Anybody would tell you. Jahangir Khan Surah Israfil, the editor of this newspaper, weekly, and many of the people who wrote with him were intellectuals of their own time. I mean, much of the discourse here that you read is about how Iran is supposed to go through this process of rule of law, limitation on the power of the ruler, division of power, revitalization of the Iranian economy, revitalization of Iranian culture. All of this is part of the discourse of all of these newspapers of the period. So my sense is that this is a kind of a semi-conscious attempt on the side of these constitutionalists to try to incorporate the message of the end of darkness and the beginning of coming of the light. So for them, and it's not again a surprise that at least Jahangir Khan Surah Israfil, the editor of this journal, along with a few of others, were all belonged to the Babi background, whether they were actual, at the time, practitioners of the Babi faith or not, but they're all coming from that kind of a background. And I suppose historians, sociologists would tell you that if you have some kind of a non-conformist background, this background eventually comes out in one way or another to reflect itself in the way that you would express your message. So he is not a member of the religious establishment, which was totally alien, and as a matter of fact, most of the time completely relegated the whole apocalyptic part of Messianic Shiism aside, these are people who are coming from this kind of a background. This I found even more fascinating when you see that how this secularization of the image, secularization of the discourse of apocalypticism in a more positive sense, I would say, not apocalypticism in the way that the American 20th century movements are interpreting the apocalypse. This is not the way. Here it means beginning of the new day, the coming of the new time. And in that regard, I found it particularly significant. So this is part of the kind of a message of Persianization or indigenization of the constitutional revolution. So how come that these ideas and this kind of an attempt to try to incorporate Western notions of modernity into an acceptable vernacular has never reached its objectives, or at least from the perspective of many, it didn't reach its perspective. For that, I have several answers. Let me start with the older ones, okay, and come through. And that may be the remaining part of my, how much time do I have? 15 minutes, wow. Okay, I go through the images quickly. It's a very familiar text. The first English or non-Persian narrative of the constitutional revolution that was produced by this very remarkable scholar of Iran, Edward Brown, who wrote, contrary to what has often been considered as the characteristic of the Orientalists of the 19th century, was an enormously supportive of the constitutional cause, and virtually a few years of his life he spent on supporting, advocating, defending against the British establishment the message of the constitutional revolution. And his account, the Persian Revolution, in which for the first time he uses a term constitutional for mashrute in European, in English language, I think one of the first, if not the first, becomes enormously important in the way that the constitutional revolution was perceived. Although Edward Brown himself later on became somewhat disillusioned with the constitutional revolution himself. But it's very interesting. This is the first opening page. Who do you see? This very suspicious-looking gentleman, Mr. Al-Afghani, and he uses it in quotation marks because he wants to tell us that he is not an Afghani, he is an Iranian from the town of Asadabad, or a village of Asadabad. So he wants to tell us that here, although this is a constitutional revolution, it has its deep roots in the message of pan-Islamism, Al-Afghani being the great advocate of pan-Islamism at the time. And then, of course, he creates a whole genealogy, intellectual genealogy, for the constitutional revolution, in where I have shown in another article on intertextuality between what Brown writes and what some of the authors or journalists of the constitutional period, including that Nazim al-Islam, the history of the Persian awakening, writes. So you see back and forth between them, the narratives has been exchanged. This is the book that Dr. Atabaki has edited on the subject of the historiography and political culture, for those of you who would be interested. Enough of promotion. So here, what he would like to tell us, and we believe him, in the earlier days of the constitutional revolution, that there is a sense of unanimity. Look at these people. These are members of the religious establishment, the religious clerical class. The gentleman sitting here in the middle is Sayyid Muhammad Tabatabai, one of the two great promoters and supporters of the constitutional revolution, firmly and sincerely believing in the message of the constitution. A few people further down is Sheikh Fazlullah Nuri here, sitting, who later on came to be the arch opponent of constitutionalism and lost his life as a result of that. He was executed in end of the 1909. One of the very few instances, perhaps the only instance of a major mujtahid being executed or even punished. So that's a very a traumatic event. Sayyid Muhammad Tabatabai himself did not have a better time. He was forced to go to exile or self-exile in around 1909, 1910, when the expectations of the constitution as far as these clerical class were concerned turned sour. Now, this appears to us all with their turbans and in their gowns, and therefore they're all the same. Not so. Sorry, I still have. There was much difference between who were these turbaned fellows that we saw in deaths and similar pictures. There were, as in any other hierarchy, there were a social hierarchy here, the upper ranks, the middle ranks, and the lower ranks. The upper ranks were this very prominent mujtahids that you would see, the doctors of law. The lower ranks, or rather the middle ranks, were this fellow here, Jamaluddin Isfahani. Wa'iz, as the title suggests, he was a preacher. The preachers in the clerical hierarchy held a much lower position than these high-ranking mujtahids. But what they had that the mujtahids sometimes didn't have, or most of the time didn't have, they were great preachers, they were orators. Well, similar to what you would find in the orators of the, I believe, the French Revolution. They were the movers and shakers. They were the people who would bring people to the streets or to the mosques most of the time. Their message was not the message of the higher echelons of the hierarchy. Their message was a message of subversion, change, bringing about a new vision of Islam, a new vision that corresponds to the reality of modern world. And many of them, again, coming from non-conformist backgrounds. Jamaluddin Wa'iz Isfahani was accused throughout the course of the Constitutional Revolution up to the time that he was executed, actually, in 1909, in 1908, as a Babi. He is the father of the famous writer Jamaluddin Jamalzadeh, Muhammad Ali Jamalzadeh. And it was typical of a number of preachers like him who already from the late 1890s onwards were subverting not only against the authority of the state or the injustices of the state in Isfahan, but against the religious establishment. He wrote a very famous drama, again of apocalyptic nature. It's the end of the time. It's when the moment of the resurrection of the dead, and people were brought, according to the Islamic scenario, were brought for the trial before God. And this great mujtahid of Isfahan, Agha Najafi, some of you might be familiar with him, the arch conservative of Isfahan, appears before God, and in an Isfahani accent that he uses in the drama, starts actually bargaining with God and saying, okay then, well, it may not apply to me, you know, there are all kinds of juristic reasons why I did or why that, why I did this or that. He became a kind of a clandestine voice of dissent in pre-constitutional and early constitutional period. He also wrote another book, along with another popular preacher, Beheshti, which he called the dress of virtue, or the gown of virtue, lebas taqwa, in which he actually advocated strongly in favor of the merchant class of Isfahan, who were suffering as a result of the import of goods from nowhere else but Manchester, and how that basically ruins the life of the local industries in the bazaars of Isfahan. So it's not an accident that a person like him is being recognized as the kind of an activist of the constitutional revolution. Not this gentleman. This is Sheikh Fazlullah Nuri that we saw a moment ago. This is in 1908, when he starts advocating the message that indeed, if there would be a change, if there would be a change of revolutionary change, it's not going to be constitution in a Western model, but it's going to be a constitution in the model of the Sharia. And he, along with others, coined the terms called mashru'a, which actually does not exist in Arabic. Mashru'a, like mashruta, is a kind of a play on the word, in a sense, to try to compete with the concept of the mashruta. That is what it is. This is a shar system. This is a religious sacred law. And who are those who are supposed to interpret the law? It is us, the mujtahid, like me. So if anything is going to happen, it is our turn. That was a very different message from the message of the lower ranks of the clergy. If we move on quickly, I know we don't have time. By the 1920s to 40s, we come across a number of accounts about the constitutional revolution that were, I'm just truncating my talk because, as a matter of fact, there is much more into it. But these are the three major figures that wrote about the constitutional revolution in Persian. Most significant, well-known, and widely read up to today's Iran is Ahmad Kasravi. The other one is Mehdi Malikzadeh, the son of one of those preachers. The third one is Yahya Dolatabadi, himself belonging to that kind of a Babi milieu of the late 19th century and the time of the Constitutional Revolution. All three accounts are fantastic and very important, but all three accounts share something, and that is that they dodge, they fudge the whole idea that the constitutional movement was the movement from these lower ranks of the clergy that were coming from a very different background than the upper ranks, the upper echelons. And therefore, if you read the account of Kasravi, there is a huge question mark throughout the 2 volumes that he writes, very passionately, very beautifully, in this kind of self-styled, pure Persian of his own, giving you a nationalist message, a romantic nationalist message of the constitutional revolution, but is a message that does not indeed give the full story to you. The trauma of Fazlullah Nuri, for the 3rd time appearing in our talk, and not without a reason, here is the image of Fazlullah Nuri on the gallows when the constitutionalists win against the royalists. Why he was on the gallows? Not only because he was advocating the kind of a counter discourse to the constitutionalism, but the fact that he basically abandoned the whole idea that there should be a constitutional regime anyway, and went back happily to the laps of Muhammad Shah and the royalists and collaborated with them throughout the course of the minor tyranny. That is the aspect when we talk about representations of the Islamic Republic representations of constitutional revolution in the Islamic Republic, is that totally is covered up. You don't hear much about the fact that Sheikh Fazlullah Nuri was executed because he was supporting a royalist regime that was reactionary and against the constitution, not because he was the hero of the constitutional revolution. That indeed what you would read in today's textbooks in our time. If you talk to an average student, I'm sure there may be some here who had been actually to the, thank you, to the school in Iran, they would tell you he's the hero of the constitutional revolution. And the whole story that is where everything went wrong. We heard earlier on from Dr. Atabaki how now again this debate is coming back to say, yes, there has been a moment in the early days of the Constitution when everything went wrong and these guys didn't win. These guys were not the winners of the constitutional revolution. But they often, and most of the time, I actually did make a count of the number of the high-ranking clergy at the time of the minor tyranny. I think 70% of the, at least 70% of the high-ranking clergy were the supporters of the royalists, going back to the old idea of the supporting the Qajar state in return for maintaining their own privileges in the system. And the constitutional revolution would basically subverting all of that. More, yes, the sense of kind of a failure goes beyond the image of, beyond the dispute of the constitutionalists versus the reactionary clerical establishment. By 1909, there was a great kind of sense of triumphalism and victory over the forces of royalists when people like the fighters in the Tabriz resistance, the Sattar Khan, or the representatives of the three powers who actually conquered Tehran and brought back the revolutionary regime to the capital, kind of posed in this beautiful, in my opinion, postcard that shows the three, the middle one from the Raj to the Caspian region, the one on the right from Tabriz, the one on the left from the Bakhtiaris, are coming together from three parts of the country and in a sense showing, posing as a gesture of national unity. This has already by 1909, 1910 has been questioned because of the tragic stories that we don't have time to go to them. A poet of the constitutional period, Arif, who is well known because he is indeed part of this modernity process, he composed this famous songs of the revolution. He was the bard of the revolution in a sense. Already in 1909, when the revolutionaries are in Tehran and successful and they defeated the royalists, composes a very famous song. Do I have time only to read the, okay, all right. But it takes me 2 minutes to get to it. Yeah. Okay, but it's worth actually hearing it. Well, it's worth hearing it in Persian when it's been sang recently, or a number of times by various vocalists, but I'm not going to attempt that. It is the time of wine and season of flower and stroll in the meadows. The court of the spring now is free from crows and blackbirds. Because of the blessed clouds, China envies the land of Ray. He used the word Khotan, and I would mention why he's using that term. For the sake of the homeland, a melancholic like me became a caged bird. So he already feels that he's a caged bird. How mischievous you are, oh, the fateful wheel of destiny. How grudging you are, you, the fateful will of destiny. What a rascal you are, you, the fateful will of destiny. Neither fate nor justice you know. you the faithful will of destiny. Of the blood of the nation's youth, red tulips have bloomed, mourning their cypress-like heights. Cypresses have bowed down. In this sorrow, nightingales crawled under the shadow of the roses, grieving their loss. The roses too, like me, have torn their robes. This is how he celebrates the victory, the triumph of the constitutionalists in Tehran, and with a kind of a foresight, because soon after, as I quickly move to the images here, I say, yeah, one thing I cannot avoid. Here it is, this is a picture of 1909, a year after the victory of the constitutionalists. Who do you see here? The old elite with a few members added to them, back in power. That's why the bard of the revolution is already mourning. Here is the Azadul Mulk. This is 1911, actually. This is Azadul Mulk, who was the chief Khan of the ruling tribe. A number of very important Einot Dole here, who was the arch enemy of the constitutionalists, who fought against the constitutionalists for months in Tabriz. You see here, standing next to one of the heroes of the constitutional revolution, Sardar Asad Bakhtiyari. Who are these? These are the elite. These are no longer that grocery guild that you saw earlier on in the earlier picture. Or soon after that, you see a military element added to them in order to maintain the law of order, largely for the sake of the maintenance of power in favor of the nobility. Among them, very great intellectuals. This is Mirza Hassan Moshiruddoleh, one of the great constitutionalists of the period. This is Abul Qasim Qaragozlu, a Bodleian educated, great, sophisticated friend of Lord Curzon, who became the regent of the post-1911 when there was a minor king in power. This was the image of around the same time, 1909, 1910, when the Russians actually occupied northern Iran after the 1907 agreement of the zones of influence. This is happening on the day of Ashura, that they actually hanged 11 of the constitutionalists on the charge of sedition against the Russian authorities, and very proudly posed in front of them. And no less than a chief correspondent of the Times of London, David Fraser, wrote a book, Persia and Turkey in Revolt, in 1910, as a collection of his correspondence from Iran, in which he praised Muhammad Ali Shah, the deposed ruler of Iran, and Colonel Liakhov of the Cossack Brigade, who actually bombarded the Iranian Majlis. So that's where you see this enormous kind of a contention, not within the system itself, but from outside as well. And then, of course, the voice of the American, the strangling of Persia, 1912, Morgan Schuster, who was invited to Iran to reorganize and reform the Iranian finances, and was booted out by both representatives of both powers, the British and the Russians, and the closure of the Majlis in the very end of 1911, and the 24th of December, I think they were giving themselves a gift, 24th of December 1911, and the end of the second Iranian Majlis, and the beginning of this profound sense of disillusionment on the side of the constitutionalists. I used here kind of an entertaining image of a Japanese poster produced around 1900, showing the power of the Russian Empire and how its various tentacles are suffocating all the nations, and you see poor Persia here, and a number of other countries. This is the very beginning of the Russo-Japanese conflict over Manchuria. It's a very well-known poster. I included that here because, in a sense, it was the sense of aspirations of the Iranians to think that one day they would be able to liberate themselves from this pressure of their northern neighbor. However, what became in this kind of a rough caricature of the time of the Constitutional Revolution, probably around 1913, in one of the journals, Kashkul, which shows the rulers of the countries of Asia all are the dogs being fed by the Russians and the English. So that's the image that the constitutionalists ended up with by the time of the by the beginning of the First World War. Once the First World War happened, whatever was remained as a hope for the success of the Constitutional Revolution was completely shattered. Thank you so much.